Okay, so this session, at the beginning, Dave Chalmers made a distinction between the short-term issues and the long-term issues, and that's distinguished from the very long-term issues, but the long-term and the very long-term have to do with AI systems as moral agents. The short-term is something quite different. They're not moral agents. They're systems that hopefully can help us. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this session. We're going to be talking about autonomous weapons, autonomous cars, autonomous financial decision makers, autonomous sex robots. And our first speaker is Peter Asaro. He's a philosopher of science, technology, and media, and a professor at the New School. His work focuses on the social, cultural, political, and ethical dimensions of military robotics. He's writing a book about social and ethical issues raised by robotics, and his title is Killer Robots and the Ethics of Autonomous Weapons. And we're going to have a strict 20 minutes talk and 10-minute discussion policy, because otherwise we won't be finished by the time for the next thing on the agenda.
Thank you. So today we're going to talk a little bit about autonomous weapons systems, or killer robots, as they're known in the media and other places, and how that kind of relates to AI ethics and some of the questions you've been talking about already today and we'll continue to talk about tomorrow. I want to define what we mean by autonomous weapons systems in a more general way, talk about the fundamental ethical questions that are raised really by these systems, and the kind of response that I think we can come to. And it's really kind of driven by some philosophical reflection on what the real problems are, both practically and ethically, and meaningful human control, and how this concept has emerged as a sort of solution to these problems. And then kind of come back to talk a little bit about how software and the delegation of certain kinds of moral and legal authority and responsibilities, more generally in AI ethics, can learn something from what we've done here with autonomous weapons. So what do we mean by autonomous weapons? You're probably already familiar with drones and drone strikes and targeted killing. These are remote operated systems, so they have certain autonomous functionalities. But the crucial functionality of choosing what is a target and when to fire at that target is still under human control. Despite that, these technologies are disruptive of international legal frameworks. And we have here a graph of drone strikes in Pakistan over the last decade or so. And in general, though, these are not considered autonomous weapon systems because they are still under human control. But there's a great deal of development going on within the military and different forms of automation and robotics being applied to weapons systems and weapons platforms. We have guided missile systems that are becoming increasingly sophisticated, that are capable of communicating with one another in swarms of missiles, choosing amongst themselves what to target and or where to target a particular target. There's also development of the next generation of drones, which you kind of see up here at the top, which are going to be far more autonomous. They're going to be jet-powered drones. They're going to carry far more armaments than the current Predator and Reaper drones. They'll travel much faster, much greater ranges, and they're capable of doing much more sophisticated forms of autonomous, potentially targeting, and this is where it's a concern. A lot of this work is classified, so we don't really know exactly how they function or what they're doing. And when our campaign to stop killer robots started, a lot of the websites that were advertising sophisticated capabilities of these systems were taken down, or the language was changed to make them seem not so autonomous. But it's not clear what's actually in development or not. But the US has an X-47B program that's looking at fully autonomous takeoff and landing from aircraft carriers. The British Tyrannus system, which is depicted here, is very similar. They all look very similar because they're also applying stealth technologies. Europe is developing its own system, the EU. But there's a whole range of robotic systems being developed by the military for surface-based naval warfare, Coast Guard patrolling, things like that. Automated These are Russian tanks that are remote operated at this point, but could be given artificial intelligence, could be given autonomous targeting capabilities, driving capabilities of various sorts. So the platforms are coming online. There's also, of course, bomb disposal robots, which aren't weapons and are used to disarm weapons. And those are sort of not problematic. So it becomes a question, where do you draw the line? We don't just want to ban everything. There's certainly good uses. But what is an autonomous weapon? Some current systems that actually use autonomy in these critical functions of targeting and engaging with weapons systems include some anti-missile defense systems. There's the Patriot missile system and the Phalanx Gatling gun system, which essentially use radars to detect incoming missiles and then fire, in this case, a missile or a machine gun to intercept an incoming missile. For a number of years, the US deployed an over-the-horizon cruise missile, which is depicted here. They've since been decommissioned. The idea there was the ship would not have radar contact with an enemy ship because of the curvature of the Earth. So there's a big mountain of water in between you and the enemy, but you would fire this missile over the horizon, and it would use its own radar system to identify a target and attack it. Interestingly, it was never used. And it was never used because no commander ever found themselves in a situation where they knew there was an enemy that they couldn't see, and were willing to fire a weapon at it without really knowing what that weapon was going to target. And I think that's a lesson for autonomous systems more generally. Samsung Techwin has deployed for a number of years now along the demilitarized zone an automated sentry gun, which is a machine gun that uses cameras, infrared and visual spectrum to identify human targets. Right now it's set in a human supervisory mode, but it is equipped with machine guns and it has an automatic capability, and so it could fire on targets automatically if it was put in that mode. And here's the Tyrannus system that I mentioned before that's being developed by BAE that originally was claimed to have a lot of autonomy and targeting, and now it's not so clear. So we have things like cruise missiles already, but we give them a GPS coordinate. And humans determine that target and that GPS coordinate and determine that that's a valid legal target under international law. And then they send the missile to it. And the missile may actually make decisions on its own of the route that it takes in order to avoid obstacles and radars, things like that. But the humans are still designating the targets for these systems. These are more fully autonomous systems, the anti-missile systems, but they're actually only fully autonomous for a matter of seconds, where there's an incoming barrage of missiles, the system's activated. The missiles are moving very fast, so humans aren't capable of targeting them themselves. But there is a sort of human supervision over it, and these systems are targeting projectiles, missiles, weapons. These are not vehicles, they're not humans, they're not human-occupied vehicles or buildings. And so the ethical questions, I think, are significantly different in those cases. But within the international discussion so far at the United Nations, there's been a focus on laws or lethal autonomous weapons systems, which is an unfortunate acronym because we're engaged in making laws about laws. I'm much more partial to AWS, automated or autonomous weapons systems. Some people call them fully autonomous weapons, which implies there's semi-autonomous weapons, which then gets into questions about how do you define fully versus semi, and of course, what is autonomy. The campaign stuck with the tried and true killer robots, and I think that's also a good moniker. Within the parlance of the military, there's been a long-standing discussion about humans in the loop. And this is humans that are in the loop that control the firing and targeting of weapons. There's been movement towards a notion of humans on the loop, which would be humans in a much more supervisory mode, where systems are automatically doing things, but the humans watching what it's doing and can intervene at different times. And then, of course, humans out of the loop means the system is fully automated, it's going to do what it's going to do, and humans aren't really involved in the process. Within the sort of decision-making process of what is a target, at least within, say, the US Air Force deciding what is a valid bombing target, you have these sort of 6 steps. Find something, fix its position, track it if it's moving, and then you target and engage it. And it's important to realize that targeting is an act, in a moral sense, I believe. Pointing a weapon at somebody is an act that's very different from just having a weapon. And then choosing to pull the trigger or fire or engage that weapon is another act. And I think these are the two crucial acts that we should not have become fully autonomous. These need to be under meaningful human control. And I'll get to what I mean exactly by, or generally about meaningful human control. Exact definitions are still hard to come by in international relations. In terms of morality, we don't necessarily share moral perspectives, moral theories, and moral approaches, but there is, I think, a good broad sense of ground rules in the international community that emerge from notions like human rights and the UN Declaration on Human Rights that sets some parameters for what we consider moral and immoral. We also have the legal frameworks of the Geneva Conventions and others that establish laws of warfare, human rights law, and so forth. And so we can derive principles from those. But we can also apply some pretty standard philosophical theory. And we can look at the consequences. Are these going to have good outcomes or bad outcomes in a utilitarian framework? We can look at rights and duties and what sort of threats are posed to human dignity and human rights by these systems. We can also look at virtue ethics, which actually turns out to be very important in military ethics. The virtues of commanders and soldiers is highly indoctrinated, and these systems actually threaten those virtues. And then there's sentiments, moral sentiment, which I think is a more nebulous concept, but is valid, that we feel moral repulsion, that we feel that this is just wrong or mal in se. But I kind of want to go through these in a little more detail since we have a philosophical audience to some extent. In terms of consequentialist approaches, and this is typically the argument that's given in favor of autonomous weapons systems, is, well, they're going to be really great. They're going to reduce civilian casualties. They'll make less mistakes than humans. Won't that be good? And that's a very narrow construal, I believe, of the consequences. That's not an estimate of the full consequence of what it will mean for states to adopt these weapons systems, and that for that to become a standard warfare practice, for these things to become proliferating all over the world and coming to non-state actors and so forth. So I think we also have to look at the wide consequences. And it can be very dangerous to look at a simple problem like a narrow consequentialist argument, which says, well, in this given situation, wouldn't you rather protect your soldiers and eliminate an enemy with this system? Sure, that sounds good, but what principles are being violated? And I think we can make a comparison to slavery or torture, where you can easily make consequentialist arguments in favor of slavery. It's really good for the people who aren't enslaved to enslave a bunch of other people and have them, produce stuff for you. Or similarly, the sort of ticking time bomb questions around torture, that if there's one person who knows where the bomb is hidden and torturing them is going to reveal the information, isn't it worthwhile to torture them and get the information and defuse the bomb? But I think in general, we have principles against torture and against slavery because on the whole, it's better for human rights and human dignity that all of our rights are respected. And the violation of any one individual's rights in terms of torture or slavery is a violation of all of humanity in a more fundamental way. And so this is where you get into questions that aren't just consequentialist. In terms of narrow consequentialism, there's serious questions about whether these systems will actually be able to do better than humans in any meaningful sense. In terms of the legal sense, they have to be able to distinguish civilians from combatants, because it's only lawful to attack combatants in armed conflict. Computer vision has gotten pretty good lately. A lot of advances are made, and certain forms of visual distinction are actually probably going to be better by AI systems than by humans. Other notions about behavioral patterns, whether somebody intends to harm you or do harm to somebody else, requires a lot more psychological theory of mind about human agents, what they're doing, why they're doing things. In many cases, even in warfare, intent of an enemy is a crucial factor in determining whether somebody is a combatant or not, especially in irregular warfare where you have guerrillas or insurgents who are not wearing uniforms, for instance. You also have questions of proportionality. And within just war theory, the proportionality question is whether the harm that you're going to do and potentially harms to civilians is warranted by the military necessity or the threat that's posed to you. So if somebody hits you on the arm, it's not valid to shoot them with a gun. That would be disproportionate. Or if you have a military ammunition depot next to a school or a hospital, is it valid to destroy it knowing under the doctrine of double effect that you're going to also destroy the school and perhaps kill many children or destroy a hospital? Is that value worthwhile? And those are value judgments that are very difficult for humans to make. But commanders make these decisions, learn to make these decisions under dire circumstances. How we exactly translate that to an AI system is not straightforward at all. There's also a number of situations in international law, such as the ability of combatants to surrender, or the fact that a wounded combatant is no longer a valid target, and so they cannot be killed, and shipwrecked sailors, things like that. And this is called hors de combat, which means they are out of combat, so they're no longer a valid target. Then you have a whole lot of negative outcomes that are likely if these systems make mistakes, fratricide mistakes, harms to civilians, unintended initiation and escalation of conflicts. These systems can be hacked, they can be spoofed, you can do behavioral hacking where you coax a system into attacking another enemy system. Normal accidents, these systems will malfunction, they'll be very complicated. Common mode failures. These systems will be in warfare, so they're going to be battle damaged. And it's not exactly clear what that could do to different kinds of systems. And the environment is broad and unpredictable in a number of ways. So in total, there's a lot of actually narrow consequences that are bad. In the wider sense of consequences, as I said, unintended escalation, initiation of conflict means humans will tend to lose control over conflicts. Arms races that could lead to regional and global instabilities, as well as the huge waste of resources, and threats to international law itself, the norms and standards that we rely on to hold people accountable for targeting decisions, to hold states accountable for military interventions, and so forth, as they're able to blame systems for malfunctioning instead of taking responsibility for decisions that were actually made by humans. And then to get the argument that these systems are going to be great, we just should ask, well, what's driving that innovation? What are the mechanisms that are going to increase accuracy and precision and reduce civilian casualties? And are those operative for whom? What states? Because not all states are those operative. Is that going to carry when we have proliferation? Warfare is very different than cars. So we have class action liability. We can sue car companies. That improves safety over time. These sorts of lawsuits aren't permissible in international law. Victims cannot sue the manufacturers of arms straightforwardly. So they don't have that kind of accountability and responsibility. So I don't know that we should expect the technology to be driven in that direction. But then we get to the fundamental questions, I think, of human rights and dignity, and whether it's morally justifiable to allow these systems to kill. And I think the answer is no. And I think it's because it matters how one is killed. We retain dignity, we retain human rights, even when we're liable to be killed in international conflict. That cannot be arbitrary, summary, or extrajudicial. There has to be a human being who's a moral and legal agent who makes the determination that that is a justified killing. And if you don't have that, then it's an arbitrary killing. And so in this sense, for the stupid AI systems out there that are not moral agents, that are not legal agents, all of the killing that they will do will be arbitrary, and as the special rapporteur for arbitrary, summary, and extrajudicial execution said, it's mechanical slaughter. So this is improper because they're not legal and moral agents. It also undermines responsibility in a more fundamental way, because as individuals or commanders use these systems, they don't know exactly what they're going to do. They become more and more unpredictable as they become more sophisticated. And so psychologically, they feel less responsible for what those systems are going to do. So they don't internalize responsibility in the same way psychologically. And from the legal perspective, they aren't as easy to hold accountable. For war crimes, you have to prove intent. If you don't really know what a system is going to do, there's no specific intention, it's almost impossible to prove that intent. So meaningful human control, I believe, is the way to go as far as trying to regulate these systems and think about how we control them, which is a complex term that involves several parts. Part of that is positive control. You actually have to have control over the system. The system cannot be out of control. But the system has to allow a human to actually exercise their moral agency. And that means being able to call off an attack when they see that it's necessary. It means actually warfare is an act of creating meaning. And automated systems will just perform algorithmically. They're not going to necessarily generate any meaning. Humans are generating meaning. And so they need information in order to make these judgments, and that needs to be accurate and clear. But if you are just, every time a target is selected, a light goes on, you press a button, you have no idea what's going on, that's a sort of meaningless form of control, and it's just nominal human control. And then you need this internalization psychologically of the responsibility, that operators feel responsible for what they're doing, and that's sufficient to hold them accountable under legal systems. So what's to be done? So we've been working at the United Nations now for a number of years. 2009, I founded the International Committee for Robot Arms Control. In 2013, we founded the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots. We've had 3 years of meetings at the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons in Geneva, where much of the discussion about meaningful human control has come out of. Last summer, there was a letter from scientists sponsored by the Future of Life Institute, where thousands of AI and robotics researchers joined in support of banning fully autonomous weapon systems. And hopefully this coming spring, we're going to see the meetings at the UN elevate to a new level called a group of governmental experts, which would have a mandate, hopefully, towards moving to treaty discussions. And we believe new law is actually necessary in this case. There's nothing that explicitly prohibits autonomous weapon systems in current law. However, I think it's implicitly the case. Certain weapons reviews might make that necessary. But current weapons reviews are quite insufficient for the complexity of systems. What would it mean to test a system to verify its legal compliance? And what we really ultimately need is a norm that would be established. And that norm would also apply, I think, more generally to automated systems that have control over people's lives. And I think that's where it comes back to some of the other questions around AI and ethics. And I've sadly run out of time. But thank you for listening.
So you say that because autonomous weapon systems are morally wrong, they should not be developed by nations, and so you support this campaign for stopping killer robots. My question is, what if in the future it became necessary for a country to develop AWSs in order to conduct warfare? Like it was not feasible for a country to win without these systems. Would your opinion on them change?
Well, I think there you would have a situation where states have already developed them. We're hopeful that we can get a preemptive ban, so we can create a situation where states are not racing against each other to develop the technology or feel that their security is jeopardized because other states have developed this technology. So that's part of the notion of preemptive arms control and multilateral arms control more generally, where it's in the collective interest of all the states to prohibit these weapon systems. And I think we're still in that situation. If we fail to get a treaty and it moves forward, then that sort of reasoning becomes, more justifiable. I still think it's fundamentally wrong and that we should still try to roll back that technology. And when we have had bans on weapons after they've been deployed, like chemical weapons, for instance.
Hi, Stephen Levy at Back Channel. I'm kind of wondering what Stanley Kubrick or Joseph Heller would make of this discussion here. And I think that's one benefit of having a conference like this is we can look at what humans do in light of what artificial intelligence might do there. So, if you're killed by a drone, it probably doesn't matter to you whether it's a general taking responsibility for it or whether, at some point on the line the drone took responsibility there. So I'm actually wondering, it's a serious question, whether considering putting weapons like this into effect might make us reconsider the way we do our own actions.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point. And I think in terms of how the discussion has evolved at the United Nations, previous humanitarian law disarmament campaigns have focused on specifically the effects of the weapon systems on civilians. And this campaign is a little bit different because we're really focused on the decision processes and the justifications for using weapons or force at all. And I think thinking through that and making those norms stronger and clearer is good for international law.
So I want to make one point. So you actually showed some BAE Systems weapons. The Taranis comes from BAE Systems. So their chairman back in January declared that his company would not make fully autonomous weapons, that they were fundamentally wrong, and he would never allow his company to build such weapons. So I think that's an interesting data point in this debate. You mentioned on one of your slides weapons of mass destruction, but could you expand a little bit on what you meant by that and why that's relevant to the debate?
Yeah, thank you. I do think it is interesting that the BAE Systems and other roboticists and other robotics companies have come forward, ClearPath Robotics in Canada. And I think in terms of the weapons of mass destruction, the critical thing to think about in what constitutes a weapon of mass destruction is a small action by a small number of individuals resulting in massive devastation. So whether that's chemical, biological, nuclear, and I believe robotic at some form, that you would be able to, in the way that a single person can release a virus on the internet that can infect thousands of computers, millions of computers, and have global effects. As you have robotic systems networked into these kinds of global networks, a single individual will be able to launch massive attacks that result in massive destruction, and it's a weapon of mass destruction. And I think that's incredibly destabilizing globally, whether it's states or rogue states that are getting these, or whether it's cults and non-governmental organizations who are getting this, and non-state actors and terrorists and so forth.
Hi, my name is Rien Kalman. My question actually builds on your previous comment on rogue states or individuals. So could you make the argument that developing these kind of weapons would be sort of defensible as a defense mechanism? So let's say an individual, I recognize it's hard now for one individual to build a thing like this, but maybe 10 years from now it will be relatively easy. What's your view on sort of the defensive stance against something like that?
Well, I think the moral question turns on whether the system is ever authorized to target humans. So I think there's ways to permit missile defense systems, for instance, that are targeting missiles or non-human, material. Then it becomes a question of risks to humans and minimizing that risk, that you accidentally target an aircraft or a vehicle or a building of some kind or a person. But as long as it's a human, then the moral question is there. And I think whether it's offensive or defensive, this distinction is very difficult to make when you look at a weapons system outside of a missile defense system. So I don't think that's necessarily the best way to frame it.
Hi, my name is Bruce Costa. I'm with Granite Forest Sangha, and I'm wondering if you could go down a little further down this road that this gentleman started you on. So it's not the drone, it's the automation of the drone, right? So how have you thought about how you would construct a law that would enable me to know that another country has utilized automation, and how could you keep that genie in the bottle? What teeth are on the dog? How's that?
Yeah, so this is a question in arms control. It's called verification. How do you know the other signatories to the treaty are meeting their obligations under the treaty? And I think on the one hand, if you see a vast fleet of like robotic aircraft or robotic soldiers, and they aren't training very many people to operate them, that's a pretty good indication that there's a lot of automation going on in that, and that they're probably acting in certain autonomous fashion. Forensically, if you capture a system, you can take it apart, try to figure out how it works. There's ways to try to avoid making it look like a fully autonomous system or an autonomous system. There's also the argument that a system that looks like it's not capable of autonomous targeting could have a software update once the war starts that gives it that kind of automated targeting. And not all treaties require verification. And we can look at things like the chemical weapons treaty, where if somebody acts against it and uses chemical weapons, there's a huge sanction internationally for that kind of action. And so if you can find out after the fact, there's also, of course, a lot of trouble with attributability, which we see in cyber warfare that could also extend into these systems. So it could be very easy to obscure who's actually launched the attack by not having certain designations on the robotics system, or actually mimicking another nation's system. So there's a lot of risks around that. But if you have a norm in place, then you can act based on a case-by-case basis as those situations arise. The really dangerous situation is where they would have a mass army that would actually lead to some global instability situation. But I think we would pick up that kind of level of production fairly easily, that they're amassing resources and not training operators. Yeah, I think that's a. Yeah, so for the live stream, the question is, how do you know that the people making the decisions actually have the moral justification for firing on a target? And in many cases, they don't, right? They're just given an order to fire on a target. They may not actually have access to that information, but the person giving the order should. And I think if we think about designing systems for meaningful human control and actually making it a positive obligation in the treaty, rather than saying, don't build an autonomous system, you say every system you build, you have to demonstrate the meaningful human control of that system, right? It has to be apparent in the operation of the system. So you wind up then encouraging the design of interfaces that provide that information, because it becomes tangible that you can prove that it's a meaningfully human controlled system.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.